Hey guys, what's going on? I'm back here. This is Sonny Strauss with Early Virginia and Maryland Genealogy. So welcome back. So this time I'm going to go over the descendants of John Washington and Anne Pope, basically the ancestors of President George Washington. And this is all from a certain book. It's by Justin Glenn. It's a well-known book. It has all this information in it, so feel free to purchase it if you want to understand this better. I'm basically taking all the information and research he's already done, so this is credit to him, and making it visual. That's literally all I'm doing, just so it's easy to understand. Because there's one thing about genealogy, reading it in words can be very, very difficult. That's why you got to make trees into it. So here's John Washington. He was a son of Lawrence Washington, the immigrant. This is the same Lawrence Washington who married, I want to say Phyllis Twigden. Sorry if I mispronounced that. So John Washington and Anne Pope, right? So he married three times, and this is the ancestor of George Washington. So John Washington married Anne Pope. John Washington's brother, Lawrence Washington, married Mary Townshend. That's a whole separate line where there's another book. If you're interested, just look in the comment section below. I'll have sources to both of those. If you think I should do the descendants of these as well, I'll be glad to do that at some point in the future. So John Washington had Anne Washington, John Washington, Lawrence Washington, and Mildred Washington. Anne Washington married Frances Wright, and they had John Wright. This is the only one I know of from the book. He married Dorothy. And then John Wright, we get to Frances Wright and John Wright. Frances Wright married Anne Macy. And we get down further, you have Dorothy Wright, Elizabeth Wright, and Frances Wright. And then John Wright had Elizabeth Wright, James Wright, John Wright, William Wright. And then James Wright had Betsy Wright, who married a James. And then John Wright had Daniel Wright. Now, in his book, the one that all this information is coming from, he goes further and further down generations, and he's created volumes. I just got too exhausted from doing all these people. So, yes, it goes further down than what I'm showing you, in case you're wondering. John Washington married Catherine Whiting, sorry if I mispronounced that. So they had Catherine Washington, who married Fielding Lewis, Elizabeth Washington, Hannah Washington, who married Matthew Whiting, Henry Washington married Charlotte Foushee, sorry if I mispronounced that. He also married Anne Thacker. John Washington, Matthew Washington, Mildred Washington married John Bushrod, and Warner Washington married Hannah Fairfax. And this Fielding Lewis, if I'm not mistaken, is descended from Betty Lewis, George Washington's sister, unless I have that incompletely wrong, which I most likely do now that I'm looking at all these names. And then Catherine Washington, so she has Augustin Lewis, Betty Lewis, Charles Lewis, Fielding Lewis, married also Anne Alexander. No, I'm sorry, this Fielding Lewis, never mind, I'm confusing myself. This is what happens when you get into these names. Too many Lewises in Washington. So Fielding Lewis married Anne Alexander and Elizabeth Dade. Anne Lewis, Charles A. Lewis, Elizabeth A. Lewis, Fielding A. Lewis, George W. Lewis, John W. Lewis, Robert A. Lewis, Catherine D. Lewis, Lucinda E. Lewis. And then we get to George Lewis. So George Lewis, Catherine Dangerfield, Dangerfield Lewis, Mary Willis Lewis, Samuel Lewis. We get to Howell Lewis, we get to John Lewis and Mildred Carter. He also married Marion Fontaine, Elizabeth Bates Jones, Elizabeth Thornton, and Lucy Thornton. Get all those to show up. Thank God someone has documented all these separate marriages. Mildred G. Lewis, Gabriel J. Lewis, Francis Lewis, Mary Ann Lewis, Lawrence Lewis, Mary Lewis, Robert Lewis, Samuel Lewis, Warner Lewis. Now, remember, I'm showing even the students, the children that died in infancy, just to show you just for clarification's sake. So I'm doing both the children who died in infancy and the ones who lived to adulthood, didn't marry, and the ones who had descendants, which is why there's going to be so many. Henry Washington had Thacker Washington, who married Harriet Peyton. Elizabeth Washington married John Perrin. Catherine Washington and John Washington, Thacker Washington and Harriet Peyton, Henry T. Washington, Nancy P. Washington, Warner Washington, and then we have here John Page, Elizabeth Perrin, Henry Perrin. She also married Thomas J. Staunton. Again, I'm sure the lines go further than this. I just didn't do it because I got too tired from putting all these names in, but his book goes further than this. John Bushrod, Mildred Washington. She also married Bailey Seaton. I hope I say that correctly. And you got Warner Washington and Hannah Fairfax. He also married Elizabeth Macon. So he's got Warner Washington, and he married also Mary Whiting and Sarah W. Roots. He also married children: Francis Washington, Henry Washington, John W. Washington, Perrin Washington, Warner Washington, Alexander H. Washington, Mary Herbert Washington, Reed M. Washington, William H. Washington. Then we get here Elizabeth C. Nelson, Hannah F. Nelson, Louisa H. Nelson, Lucinda W. Nelson, Philip T. Nelson. And she, as you can see, she also married John Nelson, Elizabeth Washington, Fairfax Washington, and Sarah Armistead. Anne Cleve Washington, Fairfax Washington, Mary Carter Washington, Warner Washington, William F. Washington, Francis M. Washington, Hannah Washington, Louisa Washington. You got Mildred Washington, married Mordecai Throckmorton. I hope I say that correctly. Matthew R. Throckmorton. William C. Dickinson married Catherine Richardson Throckmorton. Hannah Fairfax Throckmorton married Peter Beverly Whiting. Warner Washington Throckmorton, and they had Anne B. Whiting, Perrin Washington, Hannah Fairfax Whiting, Harriet Thacker Whiting. Henry Washington married Louisa Washington Whiting, Peter Whiting, Warner Whiting. And then we have here Whiting Washington married Rebecca Smith, Charles Henry Smith, Jane Lewis Smith, and Lucy Elizabeth Smith. So many names to go through. Okay, for those. And then we get to Lawrence Washington. And now you should recognize this guy. This is the ancestor of George Washington. So here's John Washington and Pope, Lawrence Washington, Mildred Warner. So this is the Lawrence Washington you're thinking of. This is the ancestor direct line to George Washington. So he has John Washington. So this would be a half brother to George Washington. John Washington and Anne somebody had Henry Washington, John Washington, Nathaniel Washington. And you should recognize this guy. Here is the father of George Washington. So Augustine Washington, father of the president. He married first Jane Butler, then Mary Ball. He had Augustine Washington, who married Anne Aylett. And they had Burdett Ashton, Anne Washington, Anne Ashton, Burdett Ashton, Sarah Ashton. And then you get to Augustine Washington, Alexander Spotswood, Elizabeth Washington, Alexander Elliot Spotswood, Anne Washington Burwell Spotswood, Elizabeth Butler Spotswood, George Augustine Washington Spotswood. Bushrod Washington married Henrietta B. Brain Spotswood. John Augustine Washington Spotswood. Man, that's a lot of names. And then Mary Randolph Spotswood. And then you get to John Augusta Washington, Lawrence Washington, William Augustine Washington married Sarah Taylor. He also married Lee and Jane Washington. He had George Corbin Washington, Hannah Bushrod Washington, Lawrence Washington, Sarah Taylor Washington, and William Augustine Washington. So this would be the junior. And then we get to Butler Washington, Jane Washington. We get to Lawrence Washington. So this would be the half-brother of George Washington, who had Mount Vernon estate before it was given to George Washington, his half-brother. So here's Fairfax Washington, Jane Washington, Mildred Washington, and Sarah Washington. And then you get to Fielding Lewis, who married Betty Washington. This is the sister of the president, not half sister, actual sister. And she had a lot of children. Augustine Lewis, Betty Lewis, Charles Lewis, and Alexander married Fielding Lewis. Fielding Lewis married Elizabeth Dade. You can see why this would get confusing in relationships. And then let's see, he also, no, perfect. Anne Lewis, Charles A. Lewis, Elizabeth A. Lewis, Fielding A. Lewis, George Warner Lewis, John Washington Lewis, Robert Alexander Lewis, Catherine Day Lewis, Lucinda E. Lewis, yeah, that's Charles A. Lewis, George Lewis married Catherine Dangerfield, Dangerfield Lewis, Mary Willis Lewis, Samuel Lewis. Man, if I was a cousin, I would have the hardest time differentiating between people. No wonder they use nicknames. Howell Lewis, you got Lucy Thornton, Elizabeth Thornton, Elizabeth B. Jones, and Mary Ann Fontaine married John Lewis. He also married Mildred Ann Carter. This guy went through 5 women. Man, that's a lot of death. Mildred Gregory Lewis, Gabriel Jones Lewis, Francis Lewis, Mary Ann Lewis, Lawrence Lewis, Mary Lewis, Robert Lewis, Samuel Lewis, and Warner Lewis. Remember, a lot of these died in infancy. Keep that in mind. Then you got Charles Washington, another brother of the president, married Mildred Thornton. Francis Washington, George Augustine Washington, Mildred Gregory Washington, and Samuel Washington. You got George Washington, Martha Dandridge. She was married before George Washington to Daniel Parke Custis. John Augustine Washington, Hannah Bushwad, Washington, Corbin Washington, William Augustine Washington, Jane Washington, Mary Washington, Mildred C. Washington, William Augustine Washington, Bushrod Washington, Lawrence Washington, Sarah T. Washington, William Augustine Washington, George Corbin Washington, Hannah Bushrod Washington. Now, when Mount Vernon Estate, in the will of George Washington, he passed Mount Vernon Estate to this Bushrod right here as his nephew. So Mount Vernon went from Lawrence Washington, half brother of George Washington, to George Washington. Then the Mount Vernon Estate went to this guy, Bushrod Washington, his nephew. And then you get Mildred Washington, Samuel Washington, who married all these women: Susanna Holden, Anna Steptoe, Lucy Chapman, Mildred Thornton, Jane Champ, and his children: Ferdinand Washington, George Steptoe Washington, Harriet Washington, Lawrence Washington, Lucy Washington, Thornton Washington, Tristram Washington, John Perrin Washington. And that's for him, Augustine. Then we get to Henry Washington and Mary Butler. You got Bailey Washington married Catherine Stork, Bailey Washington, Elizabeth Washington, Henry, John, Mary Butler, William Washington. And then this guy married Catherine Washington and Betty Massey. They had Bailey, Butler, Catherine T, Henry, John, Lawrence, Mary, Mildred, Nathaniel Washington, William H, Anne, and Elizabeth Washington. Mary Washington and Nathaniel Washington. Then you had John Washington, Margaret Stork, Elizabeth, John, Nathaniel, William Washington, Mildred Washington, and Nathaniel Washington, and Mary had John Washington. And that is all complete for that. So, as much as you can see, and then we get to Henry Willis, Mildred Washington. He also married, she married Roger Gregory and John Lewis. So we get to Lewis Willis, married Ann Carter, and married Chomp. So we get to here. Henry, Jane, John Whittaker, married Chomp, Mildred Washington, William Chomp, Bird Charles, and Charles Willis, all Willises. And then you get to Elizabeth Gregory, Thomas Walker, Reuben Thornton, Henry Willis, all marriages. And then Francis Gregory and Francis Thornton. Francis George John Mary Churchill and William Thornton. She also married William Chomp. And then John Thornton and Mildred Gregory, Elizabeth Lucy, Mary, and Mildred Thornton. And now I'm out of breath. And that is about as complete as I can get. Remember, look in the comment section below if you want the resources where I got this material, and you can look through yourself.